What's up guys, my name is Ace, and visual recoil is a pretty important topic to be talking about here for Season 3 of Battlefield 6, partially because it appears they've increased the amount of visual recoil you experience by default, and then second, they've also introduced a new attachment called the Aftermarket Buffer, and this one reduces visual recoil. So we will be looking at a bunch of side-by-side comparisons with various weapons. However, first, let's have a look at the comparison of visual recoil from Season 2 to Season 3 of Battlefield 6. Keeping in mind, I covered all of the actual recoil changes in yesterday's video. I will leave a link to that in the description down below, where I went through every full auto gun in the game and showed before and after with their recoil plots, since there were adjustments across the board to recoil. But today, it's not so much about shot placement, and it's more just how much the gun itself is moving in your hand. That's what we're talking about when it comes to visual recoil. How obstructive is that movement, or how distracting is that movement of your gun while firing? So I'm going to play through a bunch of side-by-side comparisons from Season 2 on the left, Season 3 on the right, and the main thing I want you to pay attention to is the gun itself and how much it's shaking on your screen, not so much what's happening on the wall that we're actually shooting here. And while this does vary from gun to gun, you can definitely see with some of the guns, there is clearly more visual recoil. That gun is bouncing around more in Season 3 compared to Season 2. And that can make it that much harder to track targets and also to control your recoil appropriately. If you can't really see what's going on, it makes it difficult to know what you need to do to control your recoil in that moment. So this is where the new Aftermarket Buffer attachment comes in. With this, the description just states that it reduces visual impacts of recoil while firing. It has no impact on your actual recoil, so your bullets are going to land exactly where they would have landed if you weren't using this attachment. However, the gun is just going to be shaking less in your hands, and this is a very cheap attachment as well. It only costs 5 points, and it's in the ergonomics category of your attachments. Now, this attachment isn't available on every gun in the game, so let's just take a quick look. I made sort of a cheat sheet for you guys to see what this is available on and what it isn't available on. And I think it's pretty straightforward. Anything that has an X on it does not have access to the Aftermarket Buffer. Everything else does have access to that. So about half of the assault rifles and SMGs have access to this. Most of the carbines have access to this. Only 3 LMGs have access to this. And then when it comes to DMRs, 3 of them have access to the Aftermarket Buffer as well. And with that in mind, let's start diving into the side-by-side comparisons. However, one last thing I wanted to point out, just sort of a recap here. The zoom level of your optic is also going to have quite a big impact on your perceived visual recoil. And it's the reason I'm almost always using a 1x optic, or at most a 1.75, at least on a regular full auto gun. And to be clear, this is just a perspective thing. There aren't actual different values here. It's just as you zoom in with something, you're going to notice minor movements a lot more than if you're zoomed out. And so it might be harder to see targets in the distance, but it's much easier to track those targets as you're firing because your camera isn't bouncing around as much when you're zoomed out. And so with that in mind, for all my tests going forward, looking at the Aftermarket Buffer versus not having the Aftermarket Buffer, I'm just going to be using the ROM 1.75 optic just for consistency's sake. And let's have a look at these comparisons. I tried to pick different guns from different categories, and it's quite clear looking through these clips that the Aftermarket Buffer does have a noticeable impact on the level of visual recoil that you're experiencing. Now, obviously, some guns are going to benefit from it more than others because some guns, even after the updates, they really don't have that much visual recoil. I mean, look at the SGX, for instance. There's not a whole lot going on there when it comes to visual recoil, and honestly, I don't think the Aftermarket Buffer would really have that much of an impact on my performance with that gun. Whereas with the M417, for instance, that's going to make a much bigger difference because that gun has a lot more visual recoil. And especially when we zoom in, you can really see just how much this is going to be limiting that weapon movement. And that can absolutely make it easier to hit targets, especially at range. So overall, when it comes to my thoughts on this Aftermarket Buffer attachments, is it an absolute must-have? Well, I would say it kind of just depends on the weapon. Of course, you could get by without it on anything because it has no direct impact on where your bullets are actually landing. But as I'm sure many of you know, the amount of visual recoil you experience can have an impact on your ability to properly track targets or control recoil, and therefore it still can have an impact on the outcome of some gunfights. I think the fact that it's such a cheap attachment as well makes it a great option if you just got those extra 5 points available on your loadout and you don't know where to put it. It's never going to hurt you to throw this attachment on, so it's excellent in that case. And then in the case of some guns that have a lot of visual recoil, like the M417 for instance, yeah, I would try to make sure that I'm getting this Aftermarket Buffer on there and building the rest of my attachments around that, because it can have such a big impact on that particular gun. As for my general thoughts on the apparent visual recoil increase from Season 2 to Season 3, Honestly, I'm not the biggest fan of that. It's not a deal breaker by any means. I just find that visual recoil, especially when you take it too far, it can be very unnecessarily jarring, and in some ways it can feel as though it's taking some of the skill out of the equation because it's just an added distraction that makes it that much more difficult to properly control your recoil, for instance, which is one of the mechanical skills in the game, is your ability to control recoil, and this is just an obstruction to prevent you from being able to do that optimally. Now, at the same time, visual recoil isn't a terrible thing altogether, and I think it's important for visual immersion and to make it feel like your gun's actually got a certain level of power to it. And in a game like Battlefield, where they at least tend to aim in the direction of visual immersion and realism, even though under the hood, gameplay-wise, it's got a lot of arcadey features to it, I totally get why they wouldn't want to eliminate visual recoil, for instance, like you may see with an FPS game that's more so tuned to be highly competitive. So I definitely think there's a sweet spot to hit when it comes to visual recoil, and honestly, I thought it was totally fine before this update. I didn't really feel like they needed to add more visual recoil to things. Actual recoil, that's totally fine in my eyes, but visual recoil just seemed a little unnecessary, and almost like they increased it so they could justify the addition of this new attachment. Now, of course, these are just my opinions, and I'd love to hear what you guys think in those comments down below. First off, how do you feel about the fact that they've generally increased the visual recoil you'll experience in this season compared to the previous one? And second, what are your thoughts on this aftermarket buffer attachment? Do you see yourself using this very much, or maybe not? If you enjoyed this video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.